Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, looking at the ways in which the Paris Peace Treaties can be judged. Were they essentially good treaties or fatally flawed? Were they justified or were they harsh and unfair? And in thinking about these judgments, you need to think about the context of the Paris Peace Conference, the perceived causes of the war that preceded it, as well as the nature of that war, the key clauses of the treaties, and too the aims of its authors, the prevailing mood of the conference, and how countries then reacted to the terms of the treaties. Now a few comments on how we might judge the treaties. Fair would mean that Germany deserved to be treated that way. Fair suggests an even-handed, balanced judgment, delivered without bias or prejudice, whereas a just treaty suggests that it was lawful, even morally correct. Again, a deserved punishment, but it does recognise too the passions of the time. So what was justified in the circumstances of 1919 may not be seen that way in the 21st century. And so, of course, you have to go back to the causes of the war and the way in which the war was fought. I think that is absolutely essential. If countries were guilty, then some level of punishment seems both fair and just, though you can still question the level of punishment. But with regard to whether the treaties were just, you also have to go back to the organisation of the peace conference and the issue that the terms of the treaties were dictated. No case for the defence was presented, as the defeated countries were not invited to the discussions. Hence my point about lawful. But just also links back to the mood in 1919. Can the treaties be justified, even though they were diktats, given the mood of the French and British people and everything they had been through? And if we consider what the Germans imposed on Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and for that matter, the French in the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871. It's complicated, but that's okay. You don't have to always reach a definitive conclusion. It's important to show the complications and that there are different views on an issue. It shows you've thought about the history you've studied. As for the more basic question of whether the treaties were good or not, well, hindsight is a wonderful thing. And that's okay too. You're an historian, and so you are looking at events and decisions in hindsight. And you could make use of the too harsh, not harsh enough debate. You will have come across this, of course, in IGCSE. Was it wise to have settled on a compromise? That the treaties, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, were a compromise, meant that the wisdom on either side of that debate was also compromised. If a lasting peace was the aim, which it was for Wilson and Lloyd George for the most part, then the treaties were too harsh. If the aim was security, which it was for Clemenceau, then they were not harsh enough. The key, I think, is the French perspective, and we need to understand that perspective. Georges Clemenceau, in his hatred and fear of Germany, was most in tune with his own people, despite the attempt to assassinate him. He had fought against the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, fighting on in Paris after the French had been defeated. He had endured that defeat, the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, and the peace terms imposed on France by the Germans, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine included. This time it was the Germans who had been defeated, but the price paid by France had still been high. Out of a population of less than 38 million, 8.5 million men were mobilized. More than 5 million of them were killed or wounded. Almost 4 million hectares of land were devastated, together with 4,000 towns and villages. 600,000 buildings were destroyed, among them 20,000 factories and workshops. And their coal mines were deliberately flooded as the Germans retreated. But ultimately, of course, there is the matter of guilt, and that must link to the fact that these were one-sided dictated peace terms. Now, I've covered this in my series of causes presentations, but here I would add something that you won't have come across in your textbooks, and that's the arrogance of the big three. We see it in the fact that they dictated the terms. Take it or leave it, but if you leave it, we'll crush you. That was their attitude, and I think it's underlined by their decision not to allow the naughty countries to join the League of Nations until they had proven themselves trustworthy. We also see it in the arrogance that they could redraw the map of Europe, listening to representations from different nationals, but still making the key decisions themselves. President Wilson was not shy in voicing his opinions, even though he had never been to Europe before. We see it in the way they treated Russia, a former ally, but we also see it in how they treated themselves. Japan was largely ignored as the deliberations got underway, excluded from the Supreme Council. The British were careful not to antagonize them, but the Americans didn't trust them, and the Japanese themselves felt they were treated as racially inferior, and they had a point. And not just because their proposal for a racial equality clause in the League of Nations covenant was rejected, though this seemed to underline the way they had been treated. And there was the treatment of the Italians. The issue was what it had always been, the Treaty of London and Fiume versus Wilson's 14 points. Orlando pleaded Italy would fall into civil war if he didn't return home with what was expected of him. And I would add that the Italians lost something like 4 times more lives than the Americans did. Wilson talked of America's and the whole world's disgust with the old order. Orlando left the conference and returned to cheering crowds and church bells ringing, an Italian hero for standing up to the big three. Still, he didn't get what he wanted, what had been promised Italy, hence the mutilated victory. And before I end this presentation, a final very important point. I have talked throughout about treaties. There was more to the Paris Peace Conference than the Treaty of Versailles. Don't forget the other treaties. And they were all diktats. They all had a war guilt clause. They all involved a loss of territory. They all included reparations. They all reduced military capability. And they all required an acceptance of the League of Nations whilst putting the defeated powers on probation before they would be allowed to join. What I will do in other presentations is to pick out 1 or 2 key aspects to each of the other treaties, so that if you face a question on the Paris Peace settlement as a whole, you'll have something to say about them all. do please give a thumbs up if you like my videos, and sign up to my channel if you haven't already done so. And please tell your friends about it. Spread the word for me. But for now, as always, let me thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.